Buddha's Vipassana-only myth. Why insight alone cannot lead to awakening. The term fabrication sankhara refers both to intentional actions, mental or physical, as well as to the mental or physical conditions they shape. You can recognize something as fabricated when you can discern three characteristics in its behavior: its arising, its passing away, and its alteration. While staying, anything where the three opposite characteristics can be discerned: no arising, no passing away, and no alteration. While staying counts as unfabricated in 34748. This right here is one of the Buddha's most radical premises. If every change you experience comes from fabrication, then you're fabricating your experience in ways you don't even realize. All that's experienced in dependence on the six sense, five physical senses, plus the mind as the sixth, counts as fabrication. Intentional actions and their results. This gives some idea of how subtle the goal will be, for it will have to lie totally outside of the six senses. It also indicates how important it is, in the course of the path, to become sensitive to the intentional actions that constitute fabrication. Otherwise, it's easy to fall into the pitfall of not detecting your intentions, and so to mistake something fabricated for something that's not. The Buddha mentions fabrication in many different contexts, but two main frameworks dominate his analyses. One in terms of the five aggregates of form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness, and the other in terms of bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication. Both frameworks deal first with the truths of suffering and its causes, but they also play a role in developing concentration, the heart of the path to the end of suffering. Here again, the Buddha shows his skill as a strategist. If you fabricate your experience under the influence of ignorance, your fabrications will have to lead to suffering. But if you fabricate with knowledge, they can form a path to suffering's end. And the best way to bring knowledge to the processes of fabrication is to shape them deliberately into a state of mind that is still enough and sensitive enough to allow you to detect even extremely refined and subtle fabrications. That's what the practice of concentration is for. From there, fabrications can be used to develop the insight that leads to dispassion, even for concentration. Ultimately, even for the fabrications of insight itself. That's when the mind is truly freed. The five aggregates. The analysis into five aggregates comes primarily in the context of the first noble truth, where the Buddha's short analysis of suffering is the five clinging aggregates. The act of clinging to any of the five aggregates or any combination of the five. This context can be broken down into two main subconcepts: discussions of how the mind interprets and elaborates on sensory experience in general, and discussions of how the mind creates one of the primary elements of becoming, its sense of self-identity. The five aggregates can be defined as follows: form any physical phenomenon. Although the Buddha's focus here is less on the physical object in itself and more on the experience of the object. Feeling tones of pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain. Perception, the act of recognizing, mentally labeling, and identifying physical or mental phenomena. Creation, the intentional shaping of physical or mental phenomena. Consciousness, awareness at the six senses. There's something of an anomaly here in that the term fabrication covers all five aggregates and yet is listed as one of the five. The following passage helps to explain why. Its terminology is a little strange, but one point is clear. The mental act of fabrication shapes the actual experience of all physical and mental phenomena in the aggregates for a purpose. And why do you call them fabrications? Because they fabricate fabricated things, thus they are called fabrications. What do they fabricate as a fabricated thing? For the sake of formness, they fabricate form as a fabricated thing. For the sake of feelingness, they fabricate feeling as a fabricated thing. For the sake of perceptionhood, for the sake of fabricationhood, for the sake of consciousnesshood, they fabricate consciousness as a fabricated thing. Because they fabricate fabricated things, they are called fabrications. Sen 2279. This passage suggests that the act of fabrication is presented with potentials for any of the aggregates made available by past actions, and it acts for the sake of turning those potentials into the actual experience of those aggregates in the present fabrication. As a name for one of the aggregates refers specifically to this mental process as a term for all five. Aggregates. Fabrication covers both the processes of fabrication and the fabricated aggregates, physical and mental that result. The purposeful role of fabrication is also clear in another passage that defines it in relation to the six sense media. This passage occurs in the larger context of a discussion defining all five aggregates. And what are fabrications? These six classes of intention with regard to forms, intention with regard to sounds, intention with regard to smells, intention with regard to tastes, intention with regard to tactile sensations, intention with regard to ideas. These are called fabrications, Sin 22:5-6. So putting these two definitions together, we can say that fabrication is the fourth. Aggregate provides the intentional, purposeful element in all the aggregates. Here it's important to note that aggregates are not just products of past activities. They themselves are also ongoing activities in the present moment. Sen 22:7-9 makes this point by defining the aggregates with verbs. Feelings are called feelings because they feel. Perceptions are called perceptions because they perceive, and so on. Even form deforms in the course of acting in these ways. All five aggregates make use of other fabrications to create and condition still other fabrications, and they themselves then get used by other fabrications for a similar purpose in an ongoing causal process. For instance, in the standard description of dependent co-arising 12.2, fabrications and intentions, the fourth aggregate arise prior to the experience of sensory contact. In another description of the same principle, they arise in dependence on sensory contact. Men 28 in this way. They both interpret and elaborate on sensory contacts already present to awareness, as well as playing a role in shaping the next experience of sensory contacts. A similar reciprocal relationship holds between aggregates and self-identity. On the one hand, self-identity can be built in any of four ways around any of the five aggregates, Visakha. But, lady, how does self-identification view come about? Sister Dhammadina, there is the case, friend Visakha, where an uninstructed run-of-the-mill person who has no regard for noble ones is not well-versed or disciplined in their Dhamma, who has no regard for people of integrity, is not well-versed or disciplined in their Dhamma, assumes form to be the self, or the self as possessing form, or form as in the self, or the self as in form. He assumes feeling to be the self. He assumes perception to be the self. He assumes fabrications to be the self. He assumes consciousness to be the self, or the self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in the self, or the self as in consciousness. This is how self-identification view comes about. Men 44 then. Once any of these self-identity views are created around the aggregates, those views turn around and shape further aggregates. They do this by coloring the way in which sensory contact is received from that reception. Even more fabrications are brought into being. Thus, both this assumption, the understanding I am, occur to him, an uninstructed run-of-the-mill person. And so it is with reference to the understanding I am that there is the appearance of the five faculties: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, the senses of vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch. Now there is the intellect, there are ideas, there is the property of ignorance. To an uninstructed run-of-the-mill person, touched by experience, born of the contact of ignorance, there occur the thoughts I am thus, I shall be, I shall not be, I shall be possessed of form, I shall be formless, I shall be percipient conscious, I shall be non-percipient, or I shall be neither percipient nor non-percipient. Sen 22:4-7. As this last passage shows, once there is a sense of self based on ignorance, it colors all sensory experience with questions about your current and future states of becoming. Thinking in these terms is how craving for becoming and non-becoming come about. The way out of this dilemma is first to learn how to master the processes of fabrication with knowledge. In this way, fabrications are brought out of the first noble truth into the fourth as part of the path to the end of suffering. And here again, the analysis of fabrications under the framework of the aggregates plays a role. As in 936 points out, once you have mastered any of the four jhanas, stages of right concentration, in the path to the end of suffering, you should learn to see that each jhana is composed of the five aggregates. For example, if the breath is your object of meditation, then the breath itself counts as form. The feelings of pleasure induced by being steadily alert to the breath count as feeling. The perceptions that anchor the mind on the breath count as perception, the intention to keep the breath. In mind counts as fabrication, and awareness of all these processes counts as consciousness, by deliberately fashioning these fabrications into the non-sensual bliss of jhana. You're in a position not only to see how jhana is clearly a fabricated state, but also to pass judgment on your attachments to sensual pleasures. Non-sensual bliss is much more reliable and blameless than sensual pleasures can ever be. This ability to see the fact of fabrication along with the value of alternative fabrications prepares the mind for the activities of insight, a topic we will explore further below. But first we have to see how the Buddha's alternative framework for analyzing fabrications into bodily, verbal, and mental fabrications also functions both to explain suffering and to act as part of the path to its end. The three fabrications. This is a framework that the Buddha mentions briefly in the context of dependent. The Korizingsen 12.2, where bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication are said to be conditioned by ignorance and in turn act as a condition for consciousness. What is meant by these three terms, though, is not defined in that context. There are, however, two other contexts where the Buddha does explain them in detail. The first context is a description of the ways in which three types of karma, bodily, verbal, and mental, play a role in shaping future lifetimes. In this description, these types of fabrication are analyzed in terms of the levels of skill with which they are fabricated and the corresponding levels of the cosmos to which they lead. And what is karma that is dark with dark result? There is the case where a certain person fabricates an injurious bodily fabrication, fabricates an injurious verbal fabrication, fabricates an injurious mental fabrication. Having fabricated an injurious bodily fabrication, having fabricated an injurious verbal fabrication, having fabricated an injurious mental fabrication, he rearises in an injurious world. On rearising in an injurious world, he is there touched by injurious contacts. Touched by injurious contacts, he experiences feelings that are exclusively painful, like those of the beings in hell. This is called karma that is dark with dark result. And what is karma that is bright with bright result? There is the case where a certain person fabricates a non-injurious bodily fabrication, a non-injurious verbal fabrication, a non-injurious mental fabrication. He rearises in a non-injurious world. There he is touched by non-injurious contacts. He experiences feelings that are exclusively pleasant, like those of the beautiful black devas. This is called karma that is bright with bright result. And what is karma that is dark bright? With dark bright result, there is the case where a certain person fabricates a bodily fabrication that is injurious, non-injurious, a verbal fabrication that is injurious, non-injurious, a mental fabrication that is injurious, non-injurious. He rearises in his non-injurious world. There he is touched by injurious, non-injurious contacts. He experiences injurious, non-injurious feelings, pleasure mingled with pain, like those of human beings, some devas and some beings in the lower realms. This is called karma that is dark, bright with dark bright result. And 4237, an alternative way of rating these sorts of fabrication, classifies them as to whether they lead to pleasure, pain, or to the imperturbable levels of concentration, the fourth jhana, and the formless dimensions of the infinitude of space or of consciousness, which can lead to rebirth on imperturbable levels of becoming. If a person immersed in ignorance fabricates a meritorious fabrication, his or consciousness goes on to merit. If Heji fabricates a demeritorious fabrication, his or consciousness goes on to demerit. If Hish fabricates an imperturbable fabrication, his or consciousness goes on to the imperturbable. Sen 12.5.1, because future lives will entail birth, illness, and death, and in most cases, aging as well. These discussions of the three fabrications place them firmly under the first and second noble truths, suffering and its origination. The second context in which the Buddha gives detailed explanation for bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication is in describing the factors that go into the levels of right concentration, i.e., part of the fourth noble truth, the path to the cessation of suffering. However, the definition of these three types of fabrication doesn't limit their application to the practice of concentration. Visakha. Now, lady, what are fabrications? Sister Dhammadina, these three fabrications. Friend Visakha. Bodily fabrications, verbal Fabrications, mental fabrications, Visakha. But what are bodily fabrications? What are verbal fabrications? What are mental fabrications? Sister Hamadina, in-out breaths are bodily fabrications. Directed thought evaluation are verbal fabrications. Perceptions, feelings are mental fabrications, Visakha. But why are in-out breaths bodily fabrications? Why are directed thought evaluation verbal fabrications? Why are perceptions, feelings mental fabrications? Sister Dhammadinna, in-out breaths are bodily. These are things tied up with the body. That's why in-out breaths are bodily fabrications. Having first directed one's thoughts and made an evaluation, one then breaks out into speech. That's why directed thought evaluation are verbal fabrications. Perceptions, feelings are mental. These are things tied up with the mind. That's why perceptions, feelings are mental fabrications. Men 44. These definitions of the three fabrications apply to the experience of the body in all activities, as well as to the shaping of verbal and mental activity in general. After all bodily action has to start with the breath. All verbal action has to start with directed thought and evaluation. All mental action has to start with perception and feeling. This means that these definitions of the three fabrications can be applied to all activity and mental states. For instance, they are especially useful for understanding how to dismantle the component factors of unskillful emotions and creating more skillful emotions. As with the five aggregates, the best way to comprehend the fact and value of these three types of fabrications is to employ them in the practice of right concentration. Here they are analyzed not so much in terms of how they shape a single level of concentration, but in terms of how they separate out when moving from one level of concentration to the next higher. Much as metals in a sample of ore will separate out when their melting points are reached as the ore is subjected to higher and higher temperatures, Visakha. But when a monk is attaining the cessation of perception feeling, which things cease first, bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, or mental fabrications, Sister Tamadinna. When a monk is attaining the cessation of perception feeling, friend Visakha, verbal fabrications cease first, then bodily fabrications, then mental fabrications. Men 44. The following passage describes in more detail this progressive cessation of fabrications, and I have also taught the step-by-step cessation of fabrications. When one has attained the first jhana, speech has ceased. When one has attained the second jhana, directed thought evaluation, verbal fabrications have ceased. When one has attained the third jhana, rapture has ceased. When one has attained the fourth jhana, in and out breathing bodily fabrication has ceased. When one has attained the dimension of the infinitude of space, the perception of forms has ceased. When one has attained the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness, the perception of the dimension of the infinitude of space has ceased. When one has attained the dimension of nothingness, the perception of the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness has ceased. When one has attained the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, the perception of the dimension of nothingness has ceased. When one has attained the cessation of perception feeling, mental fabrications have ceased. When a monk's effluence have ended, passion has ceased, aversion has ceased, delusion has ceased. In 36:11, it has been argued that these two contexts for understanding the three types of fabrication, karma, and rebirth on the one hand, and the practice of concentration on the other are totally unrelated. But it's hard to see what is gained by placing walls between them. Instead, it's much more useful to explore their relationships that will allow the insights gained into fabrication in the present moment in the course of meditation to provide further understanding of how karma acts on larger scales of time. Here it bears repeating. All bodily action has to start with the breath. All verbal action has to start with directed thought and evaluation. All mental action has to start with perception and feeling, gaining sensitivity to the fact and value of these fabrications in the present moment, which the practice of concentration allows for, is precisely what allows the meditator to develop dispassion for even the most skillful levels of fabrication that lead to further becoming. It's in this way that developing the fourth noble truth gives insight into the fabrications that normally would fall under the first truth and the second. the mirror of insight, the mental quality that accurately sees the fact of fabrication and judges. Its true value is called insight. The Pali term, Vipassana, literally means clear seeing. The suttas often pair it with tranquility or samatha, stating that these two qualities ideally function together. The function of tranquility is to put an end to passion. The function of insight to put an end to ignorance. In Tupi 2.9, MN 6 states that both qualities are prerequisites for progress in all aspects and levels of the path, starting with such basic endeavors as being pleasing to one's fellow monks through the jhanas and psychic powers, all the way to full awakening with regard to attaining the highest goal. And 4.17 develop before, after, or in tandem with tranquility. Nowhere do the suttas state that insight can lead to awakening on its own. To develop insight, and 4.94 recommends visiting someone skilled in insight and asking, how should fabrications be regarded? How should they be investigated? How should they be seen with insight? A way of understanding these terms in line with other passages in the suttas would be to say that regarding here has to do with noting the various ways of analyzing fabrications as to type, such as dividing them into the 5 aggregates or the 3 fabrications. Investigating refers to trying to understand their workings both in the course of ordinary sense experience and in the practice of meditation. Seeing refers to judging their value to the point of developing dispassion for them and letting them go for the sake of release. We've already discussed some of the ways in which the texts recommend regarding fabrications in the preceding section. Here we can look in more detail at how they recommend investigating and seeing them in meditation, contemplation, the Buddha's instructions in mindfulness of breathing, the meditation method he taught, most often and in the greatest detail, provide an example for how insight and tranquility can be developed in tandem. These instructions come in 16 steps, divided into 4 sets called tetrads because they have 4 steps each. The Buddha apparently did not mean for these steps to be followed in strict numerical order, rather the tetrads, or at least the first 3 of them, can be developed simultaneously because each emphasizes an aspect of breath, mindfulness that's present from the very beginning of the practice of focusing on the breath, feelings and mind states. 1. Breathing in long, he discerns I am breathing in long, or breathing out long, he discerns I am breathing out long. 2. Or breathing in short, he discerns I am breathing in short, or breathing out short, he discerns I am breathing short. 3. He trains himself. I will breathe in, sensitive to the entire body, he trains himself. I will breathe out, sensitive to the entire body. 4. He trains himself. I will breathe in, calming bodily fabrication, he trains himself. I will breathe out, calming bodily fabrication. 5. He trains himself. I will breathe in, sensitive to rapture, he trains himself. I will breathe out, sensitive to rapture. 6. He trains himself. I will breathe in, sensitive to pleasure, he trains himself. I will breathe out, sensitive to pleasure. 7. He trains himself. I will breathe in, sensitive to mental fabrication, he trains himself. I will breathe out, sensitive to mental fabrication. 8. He trains himself. I will breathe in, calming mental fabrication, he trains himself. I will breathe out, calming mental fabrication. 9. He trains himself. I will breathe in, sensitive to the mind, he trains himself. I will breathe out, sensitive to the mind. 10. He trains himself. I will breathe in, gladdening the mind, he trains himself. I will breathe out, gladdening the mind. 11. He trains himself. I will breathe in, steadying the mind, he trains himself. I will breathe out, steadying the mind. 12. He trains himself. I will breathe in, releasing the mind, he trains himself. I will breathe out, releasing the mind. Men 118. Notice that the tetrads dealing with the breath and feelings explicitly mention being sensitive to bodily fabrication and mental fabrication. Investigate this sensitivity allows you to develop insight into how fabrication goes into shaping concentration. This emphasizes the fact of fabrication. These steps also encourage you to calm these fabrications to bring the mind to deeper and deeper states of tranquility and concentration. For instance, as in 10.20 points out, calming bodily fabrication leads ultimately to the 4th jhana, where in and out breathing ceases. And how is a monk calmed in his bodily fabrication? There is the case where a monk, with the abandoning of pleasure, pain us with the earlier disappearance of elation distress centers remains in the fourth jhana, purity of equanimity mindfulness, neither pleasure nor pain. This is how a monk is calmed in his bodily fabrication. And 1020. Read in conjunction with Sen 36:111. This passage would imply a parallel interpretation of step 8 in the breath meditation instructions, scalping mental fabrication. It could potentially carry you all the way to the highest formless attainment, the cessation of perception and feeling, for that is where the mental fabrications of perception and feeling are totally calmed. At the same time, the steps dealing with the mind show that you don't simply observe the mind passively. You actively try to gladden a constricted mind, steady a restless mind, and release a burdened mind. And with what can you do that? With the bodily and mental fabrications explicitly mentioned in the first two tetrads, along with the verbal fabrications that implicitly constitute the mind's directions to itself. As it engages in the Buddha's 16 steps, all of these exercises promote insight in the form of a value judgment that the calmer fabrications can become, the more solid the sense of well-being they provide, and the more fully they enable you to follow through with the duties of the Four Noble Truths. This insight helps you use the calm of concentration to peel away any defilements that would pull you out of concentration, for instance, as the Buddha notes, without having access to and an appreciation of the calmer pleasures of khanna, you wouldn't be able to abandon passion for sensuality regardless of how much insight you had otherwise developed into sensuality's drawbacks, even though a disciple of the Noble Ones has clearly seen with right discernment as it has come to be that sensuality is of much stress, much despair, greater drawbacks. Still, if he has not attained a rapture pleasure apart from sensuality, apart from unskillful qualities, or something more peaceful than that, he can be tempted by sensuality. But when he has clearly seen with right discernment as it has come to be that sensuality is of much stress, much despair, greater drawbacks, and he has attained a rapture pleasure apart from sensuality, apart from unskillful qualities or something more peaceful than that, he cannot be tempted by sensuality. Seeing, however, regardless of how subtle the calm of concentration and how superior it is to other fabrications, it's still fabricated, it's still not the goal, because it's a form of becoming. This is where, if we want to find the unfabricated, we have to adopt the Buddha's strategy for avoiding both craving for becoming and craving for non-becoming. In other words, we have to see fabrications in a way that develops dispassion for them before they can turn into states of becoming. The Buddha recommends a 5-step approach in developing this dispassion, seeing the origination of fabrications, their disappearance, their allure, their drawbacks, and the escape from them, which is dispassions in 22-6. The first 2 steps focus on gaining further sensitivity to the fact of fabrication, the remaining one rendering a more radical judgment of their value. The Buddha details the first 2 steps of this approach in Sen 22.5. He begins by establishing his reasons for basing the approach on having developed the mind in concentration. Develop concentration. A concentrated monk discerns in line with what has come to be. And what does he discern in line with what has come into being? The origination disappearance of form. The origination disappearance of feeling perception fabrications. The origination disappearance of consciousness. In other words, in a concentrated mind it is possible to observe the 5 aggregates clearly, as they have come to be at 49 before. They are fabricated into states of becoming. Then the Buddha analyzes the origination and disappearance of the 5 aggregates. The explanation is the same for all 5, so we can focus on 1, the aggregate of fabrications. And what is the origination of fabrications? There is the case where one enjoys, welcomes, remains fastened. And what does one enjoy, welcome? To what does one remain? Fastened. One enjoys, welcomes, remains fastened to fabrications. As one enjoys, welcomes, remains fastened to fabrications, there arises delight. Any delight in fabrications is clinging. From clinging, sustenance as a requisite condition comes becoming. From becoming as a requisite condition comes birth. From birth as a requisite condition, then aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, despair come into play. Such is the origination of this entire mass of stress suffering. And what is the disappearance of fabrications? There is the case where one doesn't enjoy, welcome, or remain fastened. And what does one not enjoy or welcome? To what does one not remain fastened? One doesn't enjoy, welcome, or remain fastened to fabrications, as one doesn't enjoy, welcome, or remain fastened to fabrications. Any delight in fabrication ceases. From the cessation of delight comes the cessation of clinging. From the cessation of clinging, sustenance, the cessation of becoming. From the cessation of becoming, the cessation of birth. From the cessation of birth, then aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, despair, all cease. Such is the cessation of this entire mass of stress, suffering. Notice three things. 1. The term origination here doesn't apply to the simple arising of fabrications, but to the causal factors that bring their arising about. 2. Notice that the causal series in both case, the origination and the disappearance of fabrications, is initiated by your own intentional actions. This point is meant to focus your attention inside at the genuine cause of suffering, to see why you choose the unskillful courses of action that lead to unintended consequences, such as pain, distress, and despair. This approach of inward reflection calls to mind the Buddha's remarks to Rahula that to purify his mind, he would have to reflect on his actions in the same way that he would reflect on his face in a mirror. It's through seeing your mind clearly in the mirror of what you're doing that you can identify its blemishes and clean them away. The third point to notice here is that the language of the analysis for both the origination and the disappearance changes in mid-course. It starts by talking about what one individual does. In other words, the explanation is expressed in personal terms, in terms of becoming an individual, interacting with a world of experience. Then, with the arising or non-arising of delight, the terms of the discussion become more impersonal, events in a causal chain, with no reference to an individual doing or experiencing them, or to a world in which they occur. This way of viewing these events is precisely what enables the mind to escape the terms of becoming. But that doesn't negate the usefulness of starting the discussion in terms of becoming. When a mind engaged in becoming sees how its actions lead to suffering, it's motivated to change its ways, to learn and adopt the mode of explanation that avoids becoming and leads to the end of suffering. It's for precisely this reason that, although the Buddha wants to get his listeners to view fabrications in impersonal terms before they get shaped into becoming, he also has to express his teachings in personal terms so that his listeners will feel motivated to adopt the impersonal perspective to begin with. The impersonal mode of explanation that the Buddha uses here is called dependent co-arising. It's a way of viewing events directly experienced, influencing other events directly experienced, without reference to the question of whether there is or isn't anyone experiencing them, a world in which they are happening, or other hidden causal factors acting behind the scenes. In fact, instead of happening in the framework of a world, a self, or a being, dependent co-arising in its most complete form provides the framework for understanding how notions of world, a self, or a being arise and become objects of clinging in the first place. To maintain the framework of dependent co-arising, the Buddha was careful never to answer any questions about who or what was doing the events listed in the framework. For instance, in Zen 12:12, he refuses to answer such questions as who feels, who clings. In Zen 12:35, he refuses to answer such questions as which is the consciousness and whose is the consciousness, which are the fabrications and whose are the fabrications. The reasons he offers for refusing this last set of questions are the same in each case, and can be illustrated with his response to the question about fabrications. Which are the fabrications, Lord, and whose are the fabrications? Not a valid question, the Blessed One said. If one were to ask, which are the fabrications, and whose are the fabrications, and if one were to say, fabrications are one thing, and these fabrications are something salmion, else's, both of them would have the same meaning, even though their words would differ. When one is of the view that the life principle is the same as the body, there is no leading the holy life. And when one is of the view that the life principle is one thing and the body another, there is no leading the holy life. Avoiding these two extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma via the middle. From ignorance as a requisite condition come fabrications. Sen 1235. In all these cases, the questions and their resulting views come from thinking in terms of becoming, whereas the Buddha is intentionally trying to get his listeners to not think in those terms if they are to gain release. This is one of the reasons why, in M2, he states that such questions as am I not, what am I, how am I, where has this being come from, where is it bound, are all unfit for attention. He wants his listeners to get themselves out of the mental framework that forces them to choose between becoming and non-becoming, resulting in further becoming and further suffering in either case. So the purpose of the first two steps in the Buddha's five-step approach to dispassion is to provide a framework and a sensitivity that allows for the escape from that double jeopardy. The next three steps in the five-step approach are detailed in Sen 2226. Here, again, the explanation is the same for all five aggregates, so we can learn about all five by focusing on the discussion of the aggregate of fabrications, the pleasure-joy that arise in dependence on fabrications, that is the allure of fabrications, the fact that fabrications are inconstant, stressful, subject to change, that is the drawback of fabrications, the subduing of desire-passion for fabrications, the abandoning of desire-passion for fabrications, that is the escape from fabrications, Sin 2226. Here the discussion switches from seeing the fact of fabrication to judging, in a clear-sighted way, its value. As the Buddha notes in Sin 2260, all of the five aggregates do provide pleasure. If they didn't, beings wouldn't be infatuated with them or defiled by them. But it's because the aggregates are also stressful that beings can become disenchanted with them, dispassionate toward them, and through dispassion reach the higher well-being of purity. So these three steps focus first on the pleasures of the aggregates to see exactly how the mind falls for them, then on the drawbacks, to see the suffering that comes with clinging to the aggregates, so as to arrive at a liberating value judgment. The suffering far outweighs the pleasures of the allure. This judgment is what leads to disenchantment and dispassion. With dispassion, the motivating force driving acts of fabrication ceases, so the fabrications themselves cease, and the mind is released. To induce the value judgment leading to this release, the Buddha recommends cultivating several sets of perceptions and applying them to fabrications of every sort. The most prominent of these perceptions are the three perceptions of inconstancy, not self. The logic with which they lead to disenchantment can be illustrated by the following questionnaire, which is applied to all five aggregates. Because all five are treated in the same way, we can focus how it's applied to the aggregate of fabrications. What do you think, monks? Are fabrications constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Lord. And is that which is inconstant easeful or stressful? Stressful, Lord. And is it fitting to regard what is inconstant, stressful, subject to change as this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? No, Lord. Thus, monks, any fabrications whatsoever that are past, future, or present, internal or external, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near, all fabrications are to be seen with right discernment as they have come to be. This is not mine, this is not myself, this is not what I am. Seeing thus, the instructed disciple of the noble ones grows disenchanted with form, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perception, disenchanted with fabrications, disenchanted with consciousness. Disenchanted, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, he is released. With release, there is the knowledge. Released, he discerns that birth is ended, the holy life fulfilled, the task done there is nothing further for this world. Sen 2259. Notice that, in the last question of the questionnaire, the Buddha is not asking the monks to come to the conclusion that there is no self. He's simply getting them to make a value judgment. Given the drawbacks of fabrications, is it fitting to cling to them as me or mine? Know that judgment, in and of itself, when it goes deeper than any allure of fabrications, is enough to bring the mind to release. In seeing 6 rewards, it's enough for a monk to establish the perception of inconstancy with regard to all fabrications without exception. Which 6? All fabrications will appear as unstable. My mind will not delight in any world. My mind will rise above every world. My heart will be inclined to unbinding. My fetters will go to their abandoning. Ill, be endowed with the foremost qualities of the contemplative life. And 6102. In seeing 6 rewards, it's enough for a monk to establish the perception of stress with regard to all fabrications without exception. Which 6? The perception of disenchantment will be established within me with regard to all fabrications. Like a murderer with a drawn sword, my mind will rise above every world. Ill become one who sees peace in unbinding my obsessions, will go to their destruction. Ill be one who has completed his task, the teacher will have been served with goodwill. And 6:103, in seeing 6 rewards, it's enough for a monk to establish the perception of not-self with regard to all phenomena without exception. Which 6 won't be fashioned in connection with any world. My making will be stopped. My making will be stopped. Ill be endowed with uncommon knowledge. Ill become one who rightly sees cause along with causally originated phenomena. In 6:104 now, the Buddha is not simply presenting these perceptions as an exercise in the abstract. Instead, they are to be applied to your real-time actions in shaping fabrications. Here again, the image of the mirror, the reflective nature of the practice comes to mind. You advance in the practice by looking carefully at what you're doing. And a prime example of this reflective contemplation is the way in which the Buddha has you apply it to the practice of concentration. In other words, you don't reflect only on everyday defiled actions. You also reflect on the fabricated skills you are mastering as you develop the path. This is because the practice of concentration has helped to loosen attachments to activities outside of the path, and the mind's main attachments now are to the fabrication of concentration itself. When these subtler attachments are removed, the only remaining possible object of attachment is the act of insight. There are several passages, such as Mem 52 and Mem 1 and 40, that illustrate how to focus on the drawbacks of concentration. A 936, however, goes into the most detail on the stages by which concentration can be analyzed and its drawbacks brought to light for the sake of release. Suppose that an archer or archer's apprentice were to practice on a straw man or mound of clay, so that after a while he would become able to shoot long distances, to fire accurate shots in rapid succession. Its great masses. In the same way, there is the case where a monk enters remains in the first jhana, rapture, pleasure born of seclusion, accompanied by directed thought, evaluation. He regards whatever phenomena there that are connected with form, feeling, perception, fabrications, consciousness as inconstant, stressful, a disease, a cancer, an arrow, painful, an affliction, alien, a disintegration, an emptiness, not self. He turns his mind away from those phenomena, and having done so, inclines his mind to the property of deathlessness. This is peace, this is exquisity, pacification of all fabrications, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the ending of craving, dispassion, cessation, unbinding. Staying right there, he reaches the ending of the effluence, or, if not, then through this very Dhamma passion, this Dhamma delight, and from the total ending of the 5 lower fetters, self-identification views, grasping at habits, practices, uncertainty, sensual passion, and irritation is due to arise spontaneously in the pure abodes, there to be totally unbound, never again to return from that world. A 936 first. The jhana itself is analyzed in terms of the 5 aggregates that go into it. Then any of 11 perceptions can be applied to see the drawbacks of those aggregates. The perceptions listed here can all be subsumed under the 3 main perceptions. Inconstant, disintegration, come under inconstancy, stressful, disease, cancer, arrow, painful, and affliction under stress, and alien, emptiness, and not self under not self. Several mental acts then follow. First, an act of judgment. The mind turns away from the aggregates and develops a verbal fabrication that inclines it to the deathless, and then it stops in some cases. This stopping of the mind is enough to lead to full awakening in others. There remains a subtle clinging expressed as passion and delights in 22:121. The word Dhamma applied to this clinging can either mean the Dhamma, the phenomenon of the judgment inclining the mind to the deathless, or to the experience of the deathless itself seen as an object of the mind, another meaning of Dhamma. This subtle level of attachment prevents full awakening, but it nevertheless allows the mind to reach the penultimate level of awakening, called non-return. The difference between these 2 outcomes appears to lie in how thoroughly all around the meditator reflects on the aggregates as activities if he or she neglects to notice the attachment that remains to the activity of discernment, the awakening will not be complete. This means that for the sake of release, you have to abandon attachment not only to the practice of concentration, but also to the activity of insight. After all, most of the work of insight consists of developing strategic perceptions, but even at their most perceptive, perceptions are still fabrications. SN 2295 goes so far as to compare them to mirages, empty, void, without substance. The goal of release, however, is the substance of the whole practice, and 1058. So perceptions must not be confused with the goal. This means that, on reaching this stage, the mirror of insight has to reflect back on itself in a way that allows the mind to abandon it if release is to be total. There are very few explicit discussions of this point in the canon, although it is implicit in several passages. For example, it's implicit in the fact that right view is listed as a factor of the path which is fabricated, and not as a feature of the goal which is not at 90. It's implicit in the simile of the raft in which the raft is to be abandoned on reach further shore, Men 22 Sen 35 197. And it's implicit in the simile of the relay chariots, in which the chariots are not to be confused with the palace to which they lead, Men 24. And 4194 makes the same point a little more explicitly. After developing the elements of the path leading to release, virtue, concentration, and discernment, the meditator makes the mind dispassionate toward all phenomena conducive to passion, and then releases the mind from the factors conducive to release. And what tiger paws is the factor for exertion. With regard to purity of release, that same noble disciple endowed with this factor for exertion with regard to purity of virtue, this factor for exertion with regard to purity of mind, and this factor for exertion with regard to purity of view makes his mind dispassionate with regard to phenomena that are conducive to passion, and liberates his mind with regard to phenomena, dhammas, that are conducive to liberation, having made his mind dispassionate with regard to phenomena that are conducive to passion, and having liberated his mind with regard to phenomena that are conducive to liberation, treacher's right release. This is called purity of release. And 4194, in other words, the final step toward release requires gaining release from the phenomena that lead in its direction. Two discourses show that you can do this by applying to all the factors of the path the same five-step approach that was applied to fabrications in general, so as to gain release from them, seeing them in terms of origination, disappearance, allure, drawbacks, and escape. Monks, there are these five faculties. Which five? The faculty of conviction, the faculty of persistence, the faculty of mindfulness, the faculty of concentration, the faculty of discernment. When a disciple of the noble ones discerns as they have come to be, the origination, the disappearance, the allure, the drawbacks, and the escape from these five faculties, he is called a disciple of the noble ones who has attained the stream, never again destined for the lower realms, certain headed for self-awaking. 3. Monks, there are these five faculties. Which five? The faculty of conviction, the faculty of persistence, the faculty of mindfulness, the faculty of concentration, the faculty of discernment, when having discerned as they have come to be, the origination, the disappearance, the allure, the drawbacks, and the escape from these five faculties. A monk is released from lack of clinging sustenance. He is called an arahant whose effluents are ended, who has reached fulfillment, done the task, laid down the burden, attained the true goal, laid to waste the fetter of becoming, and who is released through right gnosis. 48:4. Here it's worth noting that even the streamanterone who has attained the lowest of the four levels of awakening has seen the drawbacks of discernment and the escape from discernment. It's simply that such a person has not followed that insight all the way to the end of the defilements. However, the passage that shows most clearly how the mirror of insight is applied to insight itself for the sake of going beyond it is in 1093. In it, Anathapindika, the householder of Streamantraris, engaged in a discussion with a number of sectarians concerning their views about the cosmos, the self, and the fate of a fully awakened person. Anathapindika applies the following analysis to each view, showing that in holding to the view, the sectarians are holding to stress. In other words, he focuses on the view not in terms of its content, but in terms of its status as a mental fabrication. That's an object of clinging and thus an instance of stress, or to put it another way, he looks at the view, not in terms of what it describes, but in terms of its performance, what it leads the person holding it to do. Take, for instance, the view that the cosmos is eternal. As for the venerable one who says the cosmos is eternal, only this is true, anything otherwise is worthless. This is the sort of view I have. His view arises from his own inappropriate attention or independence on the words of another. Now this view has been brought into being, is fabricated, willed, dependently, coercen. Whatever has been brought into being is fabricated, willed, dependently, coercen. That is inconstant. Whatever is inconstant is stress. This venerable one thus adheres to that very stress, subsits himself to that very stress. The sectarians then question Anathapindika as to his own view, and he responds, whatever has been brought into being is fabricated, willed, dependently, coercion. That is inconstant. Whatever is inconstant is stress. Whatever is stress is not me, is not what I am, is not myself. This is the sort of view I have. The sectarians think that they can catch Anathapindika in his own trap, but he shows that he is already far ahead of their game. So, householder, whatever's brought into being is fabricated, willed, dependently, coercion. That is inconstant. Whatever is inconstant is stress. You thus adhere to that very stress. Submit yourself to that very stress. Venerable sirs, whatever has been brought into being is fabricated, willed, dependently, coercion. That is inconstant. Whatever is inconstant is stress. Whatever is stress is not me, is not what I am, is not myself. Having seen this well with right discernment as it has come to be, I also discern the higher escape from it as it has come to be. When this was said, the wanderers fell silent, abashed, sitting with their shoulders drooping, their heads down, brooding, at a loss for words. And 1093. What this shows is that Anathapindika has taken his insight into the fact and value of fabrications, viewed as actions, and used it to find the escape from any attachment, even to the act of fabricating right view itself. One way to understand Anathapindika's strategy here is to view it as an example of what is meant in the 4 steps of the 4th tetrad in breath meditation. 13. He, the monk, trains himself, I will breathe in, focusing on inconstancy. He trains himself, I will breathe out, focusing on inconstancy. 14. He trains himself, I will breathe in, focusing on dispassion. Or fading, he trains himself, I will breathe out, focusing on dispassion. 15. He trains himself, I will breathe in, focusing on cessation. He trains himself, I will breathe out, focusing on cessation. 16. He trains himself, I will breathe in, focusing on relinquishing. He trains himself, I will breathe out, focusing on relinquishing. 118. The step of focusing on inconstancy starts with applying the perception of inconstancy and its companion perceptions, stress and not self, to fabrications both inside and outside the meditation. The step of dispassion comes as a result when the allure of fabrications is seen with insight to be no match for their drawbacks, because passion is what drives the act of continuing to fabricate fabrications. Dispassion brings that fabrication to an end, and fabrications cease on their own. The step of relinquishment is when the analysis then focuses on the fabrication of insight itself, and that fabrication too is abandoned. These steps help to explain the Buddha's strategic approach to framing his teachings, and our need to approach those teachings strategically too. He had to employ teachings expressed in personal terms, showing the drawbacks of becoming, for people to be willing to apply the perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self to their most ingrained habit, repeatedly creating identities as beings in worlds of experience as means for gaining the pleasures they've been accustomed to feeding on. He had to use teachings expressed in impersonal terms for this listeners to reflect on their actions in the proper way to bypass the dilemma posed by the need to avoid both craving for becoming and craving for non-becoming. That way, through dispassion, they could allow the processes leading to becoming to cease. And he had to remind his listeners that they had to reflect on the fact that even their insights framed in impersonal terms ultimately had to be relinquished so as to realize unfabricated release. It's in this way that the mind is totally freed from attachment to fabrications of every sort, 5 aggregates, as well as bodily, verbal, and mental fabrications in all their meritorious, demeritorious, and imperturbable forms. The reflective strategy employed here follows the Buddha's solutions to both of the dilemmas that faced him before his awakening. It focuses on viewing fabrications so as to avoid issues of becoming and non-becoming, and it enables you to use fabrications to allow fabrications to cease, arriving at the threshold of the unfabricated, and then to abandon even the fabrications you used for this purpose. As the final step across the flood, the main problem facing anyone who wishes to attempt this last step is to know when the mind is ready for it. If you attempt it too soon, you fall off the raft and get washed away by the current. If you wait too long, the raft floats near the shore but never arrives. A large part of the discernment exercised in following the path lies in being acutely observant as well as reflective, learning to read the needs of the mind in real time. The Buddha concludes one of his discussions of insight with the simile of the swift pair of messengers. Suppose, monk, that there were a royal frontier fortress with strong ramparts, strong walls, arches, and 6 gates. In it would be a wise, competent, intelligent gatekeeper to keep out those he didn't know and to let in those he did. A swift pair of messengers coming from the east would say to the gatekeeper, "Where, my good man, is the commander of this fortress?" He would say, "There he is, sirs, sitting in the central square." The swift pair of messengers, delivering their accurate report to the commander of the fortress, would then go back by the route by which they had come. Then a swift pair of messengers, coming from the west, the north, the south, would say to the gatekeeper, "Where, my good man, is the commander of this fortress?" He would say, "There he is, sirs, sitting in the central square." The swift pair of messengers, delivering their accurate report to the commander of the fortress, would then go back by the route by which they had come. I have given you this simile, monk, to convey a message. The message is this: the fortress stands for this body composed of the 4 great elements, born of mother-father, nourished with rice barley gruel, subject to constant rubbing, abrasion, to breaking, falling apart. The 6 gates stand for the 6 internal sense media. The gatekeeper stands for mindfulness. The swift pair of messengers stands for tranquility, samatha, and insight, vipassana. The commander of the fortress stands for consciousness. The central square stands for the 4 great elements, the earth property, the liquid property, the fire property, the wind property. The accurate report stands for unbinding nibbana. The route by which they had come stands for the noble eightfold path: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Sen 35-204. Notice that the messengers of tranquility and insight deliver the message of unbinding, and not the message of kana or the 3 perceptions. In other words, they themselves are not the message. They arrive at the central square of the fortress simply to serve their atha, their purpose, which is release. Notice, too, that they leave the fortress after delivering their message. The commander of the fortress doesn't seize hold of them or make them stay. This doesn't mean, of course, that they are not welcome to return later to serve the commander in other ways and on another footing. After emerging from the experience of full awakening, arahants can continue making use of right view, right mindfulness, and right concentration for other purposes. The texts mention that, although there is no further task for the arahants to perform, they engage in these path factors for the sake of mindfulness and alertness, and for a pleasant abiding. Sen 22-22, Sen 47-4, and the many suttas, in which the Buddha and his arahant students teach others, show that they maintain their full range of mental capabilities to help others along the path, but as Sen 47-4 makes clear, their relationship to the factors of the path is no longer the same. They experience them disjoined from them. In other words, they no longer need them for the purpose of putting an end to suffering and stress, so they no longer have any need to feed on them or cling to them. But as for the messenger's original role, in your own practice now, your ability to take a reflective approach to all levels of the practice, from your actions in general, through the act of concentrating the mind, through the act of developing dispassion for all fabrications, by developing and then abandoning the perceptions of insight, is what enables you not to mistake the messengers for the message, and you can Leave them free to return by the way they came. The eye of the mind isn't attached to views for. There's yet another, separate sort of reality that has no this or that. In other words, it doesn't have the view or conceit that I am. It lets go of the assumptions that that's the self, that's not self, that's constant, that's inconstant that arises, that doesn't arise. It can let go of these things completely. That's the Dhamma. And yet it doesn't hold on to the Dhamma, which is why we say that the Dhamma is not self. It also doesn't hold on to the view that says not self. It lets go of views, causes, and effects, and isn't attached to anything at all, dealing with wordings or meanings, conventions or practices. Ajahn Lee Dhammadharo, the path to peace, freedom for the mind. If we can get our practice on the noble path, well, enter unbinding. Virtue will disband. Concentration will disband. Discernment will disband. In other words, we won't dwell on knowledge or discernment if we're intelligent enough to know. We simply know without taking. Intelligence as being an essential part of ourselves. This is where we can relax. They can say inconstant, but it's just what they say. They can say stress, but it's just what they say. They can say not self, but it's just what they say. Whatever they say, that's the way it is. It's true for them, and they're completely right, but completely wrong. As for us, only if we can get ourselves beyond right and wrong will we be doing fine. Roads are for people to walk on, but dogs and cats can walk on them as well. Sane people and crazy people will use the roads. They didn't build the roads for crazy people, but crazy people have every right to use them. As for the precepts, even fools and idiots can observe them. The same with concentration. Crazy or sane, they can come and sit. And discernment, we all have the right to come and talk our heads off. But it's simply a question of being right or wrong. None of the valuables of the mundane world give any real pleasure. They're nothing but stress. They're good as far as the world is concerned, but unbinding doesn't have any need for them. Right views and wrong views are an affair of the world. Unbinding doesn't have any right views or wrong views. For this reason, whatever is a wrong view we should abandon. Whatever is a right view we should develop until the day it can fall from our grasp. That's when we can be at our ease. Freya Jan Lee Dhammadharo, Beyond Right Wrong.